There's nothing wrong with the ego. There's nothing wrong with the sense of a separate self, the personal identity. It's not something that we need to fear or run away from or try and get rid of or deny. The ego, the sense of a separate self, this is all harmless. It's just a thought, nothing more than a thought. But believing in this thought, identifying with this thought, that's a whole different story. Identifying with this sense of a separate self is really the cause of all of our suffering. All the suffering that we experience in ourselves and in the entire world is all caused by nothing more than this sense, this belief and identity in being a separate self, a personal self. You may think that it's hard to imagine living without this sense of a separate self. How can you live without a personal identity? What is living without the personal identity? It's interesting. I can't really say, because I had a personal identity for most of my life, and then at some point I stopped believing in this personal identity, this person, I, Peter, this role. It just became a role, something else, another thought. And I can use it, I can answer to the name Peter, but I don't feel a sense of a separate identity. I don't identify with it. Mostly what I experience is space, infinite space that everything exists in, including this sense of a separate self, including this personal identity. That exists here too. But I don't believe that that's me. I don't identify with that. And because I don't identify with that, I'm free of suffering. Only the personal self, the identity of the personal self, can suffer. Suffering cannot exist without this. And a lot of people may think, well, what about war, poverty, starvation, disease, death, all illness, all these things that are happening in the world? Isn't that suffering? Not without the identity of a personal self. Imagine if you were living your whole life in poverty, and at this moment in time you were literally starving to death, and you were in great pain, your stomach was in great pain, and you were dying for lack of food or water. Imagine if this was your case. You would think that there's a lot of suffering going on here, isn't there? And with this sense of a personal identity, there would be tremendous suffering going on. But without the sense of a personal identity, there is simply poverty, starvation, death, pain. That's just what's existing in this moment, but it isn't existing and happening to you because you don't have a separate personal identity. The body feels pain. You know, the life is slipping away from the body. You're dying. All your life, there's been poverty and you haven't had enough food. You haven't had enough. But this, not to a personal you, though. Since it hasn't happened to a personal you, there can be no suffering. Imagine that the identity of a personal self is kind of like Velcro. So all the suffering, all the unpleasant things in the world stick to you because you have this sense of a personal I, this self-identity. Without that personal I, it's Teflon. Nothing can stick to you because there is no you for it to stick to. There is no identity for it to stick to. It's simply something that's happening in this moment, along with all the other things that are happening in this moment. And in this way, without the sense of a separate identity, you are completely free. You're completely free of suffering. You're completely free of a sense of a separate identity. Now, even in an awake state where you're free of this sense of a separate self, this is what awakening is, being free of this sense of a separate self, a separate identity, being free of this. These thoughts can come up. You've had them all your life, so they do. I mean, I still have these thoughts of a separate self, separate identity. These still rise up. When I don't pay attention to them, I'm free. If I start paying attention to one, if one triggers me, if one particular thought comes and it triggers me and I identify with that, I go back into my habitual identification that I had before, then I will experience suffering. And that's beautiful, because that's how I know I'm no longer free. I've fallen back into unconsciousness. I'm not in my aware, awake state at that point. So in my body, I experience some discomfort, some feeling that isn't freedom, bliss, and peace, something other than that. And that's how I know that somehow I'm identifying. Maybe on a very subtle level, maybe on a very unconscious level, I'm identifying with this sense of a personal self again. But when I realize that, because of this suffering, because of this discomfort in the body, something that isn't this sense of bliss and peace, I can release it. I can realize that that's what's happening. Be conscious of this feeling, and with that consciousness, the thought arises from the unconscious. The subtle thought of identity arises, and as soon as I see it, as soon as I'm conscious of it, it's released, and I return back into this awakened consciousness that doesn't have this personal identity. It's free of this personal identity. It doesn't really identify with anything. Or, on another hand, it identifies with everything. Everything that exists is what I am. Everything. This camera, these lights, this shirt, this body, but all bodies. It's sort of like, it isn't really an identity at all. You can't identify with everything, form and formless, all that exists. You can't really identify with that. It's too much. So you don't really feel a sense of identity. But you also don't feel separate from anything, because there is no separate you to be separate from anything else. You have to have a separate you to be separate from anything else, right? You need to feel separate. You need to have this separate identity to say, this is me here, a human being, and over there is a camera, and that's not me. Over there is a tree, and that's not me. Over there is another person, and that's not me. You have to have this sense of a personal self in order to experience that sense of separation. Once the identity with a personal self is gone, you are automatically one with everything. You don't have to try to be one. Let me work on being one with you. Let me work on being one with the camera, one with these lights. It just is that way. As soon as you don't have the sense of a separate identity, you are one with everything. There's no effort involved. There's no trying to be that. You just are this. You're not separate from anything. And in this lack of a separate identity, all suffering is gone. Suffering cannot exist in this state. It just can't. You have to have the sense of a separate self, a personal identity, in order to suffer. And you will. It's inescapable. Some situation or person or something is always going to create suffering in you. Have you noticed that? You can't escape it as long as you have a personal identity. You may have moments of release. You fall in love, everything is so wonderful. But even there, when you've fallen in love, your sense of a separate self is falling away. That's how you fall in love. You become more connected with this other person, and you're not quite as much a separate identity as you were before. If that weren't so, you wouldn't be falling in love. They would still be very separate from you, and you would feel this kind of aloneness in the world, this separate identity surrounded by everything else, all these other separate identities. It's a hard life like that, isn't it? We don't really think about it if we haven't yet experienced the freedom from this. It would be too much for us to experience that this is what our life is. There would be too much suffering. So we're kind of repress a lot of this. But once we're free, it becomes very, very clear. It's very apparent how we'd lived our life before we woke up. It was hard. There was a lot of suffering in it. But it can only be seen from this state of freedom. And that's for our own protection. We have to repress this because it would be too much for us. And at some point, people reach such great suffering that this identity releases. This identity it's just too much to bear any longer. And we, for a moment, in some trauma, release this sense of identity, and all of a sudden, we feel this enormous freedom, this enormous peace, this aliveness and bliss, this love affair with life itself, with all of life in this moment. Yeah, that's the truth of our life. We never needed this identification with this ego self. The ego is useful for us. The sense of a separate self is useful for us. But we don't have to believe it is what we are. We can transcend this belief in this identity, let go of the identity, and just use it as we need to. Somebody calls our name and we answer. Someone says, Peter, and I'll say, yes. What would you like? How can I help you? But I don't believe it. It's just a role. It's not something that's real. And in this way, I'm free of suffering. And this is also true for you. This identification with this separate self is not necessary. Yes, you've been doing this all your life. All your life, from the time you were an infant, you've been taught that this body, this mind, this personality is you. And it's separate from your mother, your father, your friends, and all the other people. We've been conditioned to believe this. But it's not necessary. At one point it was. We learned certain skills from this. This is my hand, it's not me. This is something separate, so I use it in a different way. That person over there is not me. That car is not me. We needed to learn these in order to learn language. Car, tree, person, names, forms. But at some point we don't need this anymore. We can let it all go and use it as a tool, but not be used by it anymore. Because when we're used by it, when we believe it's real, when we believe the voice in our head, the voice of I, is who we really are, we're going to suffer. It's inevitable, as you've seen, as we've all experienced. But we can let this go. There is freedom. This was the Buddha's promise. There is suffering, and there is freedom from suffering. And freedom from suffering is very, very real.